Now, before we move on to persistent layouts in the next episode, first I'd like to quickly touch on global component registration. For example, if you find it a little annoying, or at least cumbersome, that every time you want to render what is effectively an anchor tag, you first have to import it and then add it as a component. I don't think it's a huge deal, but I do agree it can be a little cumbersome and it does take you out of the flow. Now, the reason why it's not available automatically, well, it's probably a few reasons. One, there are potential benefits to tree shaking when compiling down your code. Two, it can often help with your editor's static analysis of the current component. And then three, it's generally just a good practice when you're building Vue plugins to, without the user's knowledge, register a set of components globally through the entire app. So for that reason, you have to manually do it, or if it makes sense, you can register it globally yourself. And here's how. In your app.js file, where we create our app and we use the Inertia plugin, as part of that, let's also register a component called link, and I'll pull that in here, and I can do that automatically. So import your link from Inertia Vue 3, and then we will register it as a global component. And if you want to do more, just call component again. So maybe you want to do a head component or something like that. Here is where you can take care of that. Okay, so now with this small change, you no longer have to manually import it. You could get rid of this, like so, and everything is still going to work. If I come back to Firefox and give this a refresh, notice I still have my link here, and it does update the time when I click on it. Yeah, so that's an option. Generally, I would say be thoughtful about what you register globally. You can often run into some traps here. Now, for a link component, you use it so often, personally, I think it's worth it. But again, make up your own mind on this. Now, one more thing to consider. Let's bring this back. And then on users, I'll bring it back to what we had before. Another option, if you're using Vue 3 and Vue's composition API, is this new script setup style. This makes the process of using the composition API just a little more friendly. Think of it as sugar for manually exporting an object that declares a setup method. So for example, I could get rid of all of this, and simply by importing the components here, I then have access to them automatically. Now you'll see here my editor is squawking a little bit. This should work. So my guess is PHP Storm doesn't quite yet understand how to parse Vue's script setup. I bet they're working on that right now. But nonetheless, if I were to switch back to Firefox and refresh, I still see my link. But do notice I've lost the time, and that's because if I bring it back, we did accept time as a prop. So again, it's a slight change to how you build your components. But if you're using script setup, you could use this macro called define props, and this would be the same thing. And again, because this is all relatively new at the time of this recording, my editor's having a little bit of trouble, but if I give it a refresh, this is all to assure you everything still works. So I just have to wait for my particular editor to catch up. But yeah, I bring this up to illustrate that if you use script setup, it then becomes that much easier to locally register your components. So if I want to use a layout or a link, it's as simple as importing it, and I'll use my editor's auto-completion, and at that point, you can instantly use it. So one more, maybe in settings, if I wanted to migrate this over, I would say script setup and get rid of that. And then in home, and by the way, I'm not even sure if we're going to keep this. It entirely works, but it's relatively new, and it might feel a little foreign to how you typically create your single file components. But nonetheless, it is an option, and it makes things a lot cleaner. So there's your home page, there's settings, and here's users. So you could take this approach, or you could take the approach where you manually register a global component, or you could combine the two. The choice is yours.